With dozens of books to her credit, Bell Hooks is among the most widely published black feminist scholars in the nation. She's returned to her Kentucky roots and now teaches at Berea College. A conversation with Bell Hooks, now on Connections. Thanks for joining us for Connections today. I'm Renee Shaw. We're delighted to have with us one of the most prolific feminist scholars and thinkers of our time, Bell Hooks. She's written more than 30 books and is famous for her critiques about race, gender, class, and culture. She is a Kentucky native, and she returned home a few years ago to become a distinguished professor in residence in Appalachian Studies at Berea College. And we are so delighted that she is here with us today. Thank you, Ms. Hooks, for being here.
I'm happy to be here.
And welcome home officially. We know you've been here for some time, but I haven't gotten a chance to say it's good to have you back in Kentucky.
Well, when you come home because you want to, you never get tired of people welcoming you home.
Oh, yeah. And, you know, and we're good in Kentucky about repeating it because we're so glad to have that brain trust that you are back on our soil. So how does it feel to be back home?
Well, I think that part of why I wanted to come back home is that my Kentucky roots are really what made me who I am, and it's the values that I grew up with, and that I wanted to be back in a world where those values really matter. And Berea, Kentucky is certainly a place where values of civility, courtesy, community are really important.
Yeah, and Berea College, certainly such an asset to the area. And we had your colleague on, Dr. Bill Turner, on the start of the season, and he just bragged about what an asset Berea is to the area and how proud he is to be there, too. So I'm sure he's rubbed off on you and feeling the same way, huh?
Well, for me, Berea is especially important because the students at Berea are really people like myself, coming from Christian, often working class families, where they haven't had a lot of experience of the world. Certainly, you know, I had never been on a city bus or an airplane when I left my small town to go to Stanford University. And that's so much about what my new writing, which is about place. I was telling Renee about my new book, Belonging, A Culture of Place, because I think that whole sense of coming from a small town world and moving into a cosmopolitan world really is such a kind of classic American experience. But I always tell people the great thing about being from the country and the small town is that you can go out and have a wider experience, but you've also had the deep and profound experience of growing up in a small community where people care for one another, where people really support one another. And you can have that and join it with a city experience, but people in cities rarely get to have that experience.
Or even desire to, perhaps, to have that kind of experience. And we should explain that you came from what we call Hoptown, Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Yes, your birthplace, your hometown.
Where my parents still are.
Where your parents still are. And I want you to tell everyone how old or how young your father is.
I was telling Renee that my dad is 88 years old and that he was reluctant to celebrate his birthday. And I was saying, Dad, given the life span of individual black men in this nation, the fact that you're 88 and you're reading, I'm writing a new book on teaching, and I was writing about my dad yesterday, that he is still a reader. And I was laughing about the fact that he reads with these big magnifying glasses, but he's still a person who is.
Have you ever had the thoughts or the desires to write a book? If so, I have a course that will be in the description box below. Check it out.
Is staying up on things through reading and exploring his mind and learning new things. And I think you can't beat that.
Yeah, and challenging his mind. And his younger bride, your mother,
who's 76, Mom has been diagnosed. In fact, the last essay in this book, Belonging, is about her and him and their 60-some-year marriage. Because, you know, it wasn't until I went away to college that I had any idea that black men and women didn't stay married forever, because the people that I grew up with in Kentucky, my grandparents, my parents, stayed married forever. And in fact, I'm talking about them in this chapter, a community of care. And just, you know, just what it meant for us that they are committed to one another, and that I'm talking about my grandparents too, who were married for more than 60 years. I say that as a witness to their lives, I can testify that they were fine, disciplined examples of the aspects of love, of care, and commitment. And I think that these two marriages lasted so long precisely because they took place.
Do you have an example of discipline, love, and commitment in your life? Whether it be an aunt, uncle, parents, brother, sister, who?
In the context of community. So a lot of my coming back to Kentucky has been also about how we think and dream and imagine community, Renee. I start off talking about how many people in our nation feel very lost and feel that they don't have a place to belong. And I laugh because in my own search for a place of belonging, I have to confess, Kentucky wasn't on my list.
Sure.
So I talk about why Kentucky, why coming home to Kentucky throughout this book of belonging, and the sense of what it means to have a place where you love the landscape. I love the landscape of Kentucky, the hills, the mountains.
The change of seasons.
All of the precious things that we have to protect.
Right.
Certainly I write about mountaintop removal in this book and the things that we need to do. But I think that it's important, you know, to have a place where you feel that you really belong on familiar ground.
Right. And considering that you came from, I guess you could say Hopkinsville is Western Kentucky, how familiar were you growing up, and how has it been a journey for you to understand Appalachia as some of us understand Appalachia to be?
Well, it's interesting that you have our wonderful journal that we publish at Berea College, Appalachian Heritage, and I have a piece in there where I was saying that growing up, interfacing with black people from Eastern Kentucky, that really the idea of Appalachia was not as strong as the notion of black people living the sort of outside the boundaries, because I grew up in the hills of Kentucky as a girl, not in town. So, you know, even, and so my sense of my world was much more about nature, the sort of boundlessness of a sense of an expansive frontier. And even in my book, new book, I have a essay on tobacco, because tobacco played such a role in the lives of African American people in many southern states and in Kentucky, that when I think of childhood, what comes to my mind are fields and fields of tobacco and the hills. And so in that sense, a lot of what I think of as my organic childhood experience resonates with all the black people that I've talked to who are like Bill, who are from
Your childhood experience growing up.
Eastern Kentucky, and who've had similar senses of what it means to grow up in a world where that privileges self-determination and individuals taking care of themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about the physical landscape of Kentucky has changed so much, not just when you first arrived on the scene, but just in the last 10, 20 years, talking about that we don't have those vast fields of tobacco anymore, and that how mountaintop removal, those things are changing the physical landscape of what Kentucky is about, and how, you know, that's really a part of the culture is just as much as anything else, is that physical landscape.
And I think that's why the issues of sustainability and environmentalism are so crucial. And one of the big myths that I'm trying to challenge in belonging is that black people haven't been interested in the environment. I really talk in this book about black farmers and organic farming among black people, and the fact that these histories, I mean, we were very fortunate a couple of years ago when the Lexington Herald did a whole piece about black farmers and people being run off their land, because this is our history that people are forgetting. I mean, imagine what our world would look like if a lot of black people were coming back to their agrarian roots and growing their own food and being engaged in local food production. And there are many of us here in Kentucky. Certainly, Jim Embry has been a big leading light in talking about environmentalism and acknowledging that for us as African American people who were profoundly an agrarian people, we have a tremendous stake in sustainability and environmentalism. And all of those things are things I'm trying to write about in this new book, Belonging: A Culture of Place.
Yes, and speaking of Jim Embry, who we've had on this program, so we put a shameless plug. If you want to see that interview, it's on our website at ket.org/connections, and he does talk about sustainable living and how he's doing these neighborhood gardens, and it's catching on with kids more so than anyone. You know, get to put their hands in the dirt and play with the worms, but it's really fostering this sense of, you know, getting back to your roots, literally.
And a stewardship of the land. One wonderful thing I have in this book for me is I talk about the writer Wendell Berry, who was so important to me growing up, and that going to his town of Port Royal and talking with him, and he certainly writes in The Hidden Wound about the two elderly black people who were so important in his childhood as people who knew the woods, as people who worked with herbs, and so that we have that whole sense of a different relationship of black people to the land, not as black people as estranged from the land. And Wendell really, I mean, I call our talk a healing conversation, because I think that here we are with such great distances in our ages. I mean, and yet his work, I said he's been a role model for me and other black folks returning to the South from the North. And I think that that's just really important. Our trajectories are very similar, because he went out to California and New York, the places that I too went, and then felt that urge, that call to home, that it's time to come back.
And that you'll stay here.
Oh, I plan on staying here until I die, which I hope will not be many
soon.
years
That's right.
from now.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. You know, I became very familiar with your work when I was in college, and Sisters of the Yam is one of my favorite books of all time, because it really is. It is a self-recovery book. It talks about body image and skin color and hair, and how media portrayal and how we try to live up to all those things. How have you seen yourself grow? Because it seems like, are you departing from that feminist theory and philosophy to more of this?
Well, actually, no, because I think any genuine feminism really is about wholeness and self-love for women and men. You know, I certainly believe that patriarchy has no gender, that really, when we talk about feminism, I think of feminism as my book says, feminism is for everybody.
That's right.
Males and so for me, I think about my journey to wholeness, of coming back to Kentucky, as very tied into that journey of myself as a feminist, because it was as a young girl here in Kentucky, deciding that I wanted to be an intellectual, a thinker, a writer, that went against so much of the grain of how I was raised, because I was certainly raised in a very serious Christian home, that a woman's place is to be silent, to
didn't talk back.
Exactly.
And that's exactly what you did.
Exactly. So it's a kind of conundrum, because on one hand, I think especially a lot of black girls are raised in the South that this is what a lady should be, but then you're also told that as a black female, if you are going to survive in this world, I mean, my mother knew that her daughters need to get educated. They need to be able to take care of themselves and not feel that they could rely on a man. If you got a man and you could rely on him, fantastic.
Comments if you were raised that way. I need to know.
But the impetus was towards your own self-development and self-actualization. And, you know, I always tell people, Renee, that if you ask me to talk about who I am, the first thing that I'm going to say is that I'm a seeker on a spiritual path, because I feel that it's that spiritual grounding of my being that has sustained me and buoyed me and made me who I am as well, so that I tell people, you know, I don't wake up in the morning and think a black woman is waking up, or a feminist woman, that the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is give praise that we are alive and that we are greeting another wonderful cold day.
Right. But have you always been that way, or did you wake up thinking, oh, another day as a black woman?
No, I think that I was always that way, and then that in part it was very tied to growing up as a child in isolation and in a world where you really are attuned to your senses and the natural environment. I have a home in the hills down in Berea, and you know, when you're out there and it's so quiet, my brothers and sisters and I come there, and we often practice sitting on the porch and closing our eyes and just listening to the sounds. And that's the kind of thing we did as kids.
Right, right.
Growing up on the hill and just paying attention to the birds and animals and everything. And I think that for me, it's been a circular journey from those things into a more cosmopolitan world where I've had the good fortune, to write these books and to become an intellectual and to be read around the world, but then to come back to that place of your grounding, that foundation.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I was just going to say one of the points you do make in Sisters of VM is about how are we so modern? Are we so cosmopolitan, which is not the words used in the book, but that you're using now, that we've lost ourselves?
Well, I think a lot of people in our nation feel as though they don't have a sense of identity and they're not sure what their values are. And I think that that's leading lots of people. I mean, that's what Barbara Kingsolver had begun to write about too, that coming back to places where people are trying to be at home in the universe. And there's nothing like being at home in a universe where you do have a history and your ancestors. I mean, the first thing I did when I bought my house on the hill was to give praise to the ancestors, the native people and our African American ancestors who worked this land, who, give us a legacy to be truly proud of.
Yeah, and that Appalachia, as Dr. Turner said, when he was growing up in Harlan and Lynch, it was a very diverse population. It was only until he came to Lexington to the flagship university next door to us here that he realized that he was a minority and that there is such a rich, diverse culture in Appalachia that perhaps many of us just don't know.
One of the joys of being a part of Appalachian Studies at Berea is one of our goals is to make people aware of the vast diversity of Appalachia, that it has multi-dimensions and different experiences, and that there are many more commonalities between black people who are raised in the hills and white people than we have been led to believe.
Yeah. And I think that's so very true. I want to get back to your earlier roots, and I want to resist calling you Gloria. Do your mom and dad, they still call you your birth name Gloria Jean?
Well, my siblings call me both Belle or Gloria Jean, and I call myself, and my mom always calls me Gloria Jean. And
especially when you're in trouble.
Usually they say Glora.
Glora.
Which is...
or Gloria Jean, sometimes we run those first and middle names together.
And I think that...
Why did you change your name?
Well, Bell Hooks is my mother's name. And, early on in feminist movement, we found that many of us did not know our mother's name, that we can only trace our history through a patrilineal lines. So the idea of recovering women's histories and women's stories, I mean, several of the essays in this book are about quilting. And I write about my grandmother really feeling like there is so much for a woman to learn about patience and spirituality from working and creativity. All of those things, I think, have to do with recovering that we did learn things like Bebe, my grandmother that I write so much about in this book, couldn't read or write. But as a quilt maker, I mean, she was just an awesome, wonderful quilt maker. And that creativity, that sense of her imagination and what it means to to reclaim that.
Yeah.
Because I think about the quilts of Gee's Bend, and I write about the quilts of Gee's Bend in here, and what it means to think of women who create amazing art, but who have very little resources, but it's coming from a really amazing, soulful place within.
Yeah.
And so a lot of my using the name Bell Hooks has to do with calling forth those female ancestors with whom we have had that connection. I love that your show is called Connections, that actually kind of live through us in a kind of psychohistory.
Yeah.
I feel like the Bell Hooks, who was supposedly, I knew her, she knew me as a baby, but I didn't know her, a woman of strong and powerful speech. I saw that as what I was trying to be.
Right.
And, and I think that that's so crucial, that we claim those ancestors.
Right. And the lowercase use of it. You don't capitalize the B and the bell or the H and the hooks.
Well, Renee, the lowercase use of it was initially hoping that people would say, oh, it's not important who's talking. It's important what's being said. But, of course, people get fascinated by the
Sure.
lowercase.
Yeah.
But at least it gives pause.
So did it do the opposite, actually? Did it draw more attention to who's the writer and
it
less
drew
about
more
what was written?
attention, but it made people think about what's important,
Right.
who's speaking or what is being said.
Yeah.
And certainly we see that in our current, political situation as a nation, that it's so important for people to pay attention to what is really being said. And not who's speaking, or because a lot of times in a celebrity-driven culture, we don't really listen to what people are saying.
Yeah, and you've written a lot about culture, pop culture, and how the media influences our whole idea of race and gender.
Well, let's go back to Appalachia and how most people's image of Kentucky, even when I decided, to move back here, people in Manhattan were acting like, well, what are you going to do
like
there?
It was a third world country?
Exactly. Like one person said, who will be your friends? As though there isn't a whole sort of climate here. And I suppose that influenced me a lot, Renee, in coming back here.
Is that the reason why you stayed away so long?
Not at all. I think that I write a lot in Belonging: A Culture of Place about the racism in Kentucky that I grew up with, and the apartheid. And one of the things I say is that our whole nation is sort of in regression and embracing forms of white supremacy and racism that I did feel like I was fleeing to Kentucky to get away from.
Right.
But of course, it's like if you flee one thing, then I lost all those other things that I loved about being here. But now that the rest of the nation seems to be getting more backwards where race and gender are concerned, Kentucky does not have that sense of being so different from where the rest of the culture is. And so I can have those wonderful things about my life here. I mean, I have to say that I was never a person who didn't come home. I always was here in Kentucky every year of my life. So I think that's very different from people who've been away and then who make a decision after totally being away to come back. That has not been what my experience has been at all.
Right.
It's been, in fact, it was a kind of passionate anguish about wanting to be here, but wanting also to feel that I was growing in the world. And I talk in here, I mean, still to this day, many of our gifted young people in Kentucky are made to feel that they need to leave Kentucky to become fully self-actualized. And I think part of what somebody like me and people I work with and Bill are trying to say is you actually don't have to do that.
Right. Yeah. And now that we're such a global society anyway, where you don't have to live where you work or work where you live, that's even more true today.
But that you can be in a place where the values in that place. I mean, sometimes, I just feel a tremendous sense of blessing that I can be in Berea, Kentucky, where so many people are committed to peace and justice and sharing of resources, of community in its very best sense of the word.
Yeah. Do you think that you have softened over the years? I mean, most of your works, I guess, were written outside of Kentucky. And so, one, do you consider yourself a Kentucky writer? But when I think about what you wrote in Sisters of the Yam, and you talk about the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, and it sounded so militant, even though I was all for it, perhaps.
Well, you know what?
It sounded a little harsh.
I was still talking about that in a women's studies class that I went to the other day, but I just want to read this little paragraph about, I said, being a Kentucky writer is for me a question of upbringing and sensibility. All the writing I've done and currently do has the particular flavor of my growing up in rural Kentucky hills as a child and later in town. This sensibility can be likened to a seasoning in food preparation. A particular herb or spice used to flavor a dish may make it distinctly different, unusual, outstanding even. Those who eat the dish may taste the difference with no clue as to where the difference is coming from. Like many great and good cooks, I might know what flavor makes my dish unique, but never tell. In the telling, it may lose its delicious, seductive essence. And that's kind of how I see Kentucky in terms of my work, that people would
experience do a person have to go through to want to become a writer? I'm only wondering this because just like Bell Hooks or Gloria Jean, I too am a writer. And when I look at the different people that are writers, the same as I am, the same as she is, we have completely different lifestyles. But I know that there are some similarities. It has to be. Let me know in the comments if you feel that you have something similar to other writers or people in your field.
Read my books and the voice it's in Sisters of the Yam and feel like there's something different about this voice.
Right.
I see that as being that Kentucky sensibility of valuing sisterhood, of valuing connection again, but that I wasn't sort of stating that. I think partially, Renee, because I had been trained to feel that if we brought that personal Kentucky sense too close to the fore, you wouldn't be that universal writer.
Right.
You wouldn't be recognized outside. You'd be perceived to be more as a local writer. And of course, Wendell Berry's amazing legacy and his present writing shows that that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, that those old ways of thinking about geography don't determine a writer's fate as much as it used to.
Since your first work, Ain't I a Woman, which is another anthem for, I think, black women, is there a postscript to that, or was it all the 20-something books you wrote after that showed the progression of who Bell Hooks, a.k.a. Gloria Jean Watkins,
Well,
is?
it's so funny, you know, because my last few years, so many of my books have been about love. But one of the books that you have affirmed, and I appreciate that, is Sisters of the Yam. You know, Sisters of the Yam was probably one of my few books that was really written directly to
Black
the
women.
experience of black women. And as a consequence of that, it got very few reviews. But it's one of my best-selling books. And what I think about is that people who say, oh, Belle is softening, she's now writing about love, but if they came to Sisters of the Yam, which was really one of my very early books, they would see all of those issues of community, love, and care, and self-love being talked about.
Right. Do you write about love now more because that's what you're aspiring for the most?
Well, I think that, you know, what I tell people is when you go around the nation and the world talking to people about domination, whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, or religious oppression, and you ask people what motivated you to change if they had some negative position, and you can see in that their responses that often it is love as commitment, care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust that have pushed people to move from a position. I think we see a tremendous love of our nation and the American people, and Colin Powell's talking about why he would support Obama. I read his comments over and over because they're about qualities of being and integrity and how we are in the world. And that to me is the link between working to end domination, which Martin Luther King saw so clearly, and talking about love and the practice of love.
Yeah. And when you teach and interact with students, has that become almost the love of teaching? Has that trumped writing? Or
Well, actually, teaching and writing are, for me, so intertwined, but I think nothing, you know, takes the place of being in the presence of teaching students, having people grow together, the mutual exchange between professor and student, which is very different from writing. Though I'm writing a new book on teaching, and what I did was ask lots of people, what are the questions you have about teaching? And I want to answer those questions. So that's all about love.
Yeah, all about love. Well, we thank you so much, Bell Hooks. And then
Very interesting and very educational video. I laughed a little bit when Bell Hooks said her biological name, Gloria Jean, and that's only because I have a very close person in my family with that same exact name. Nothing off, Gloria Jean, same thing. Let me know in the comments, what did you learn about this video? Let's have a discussion.